The dawn of 2026 has brought the most significant diplomatic shift since the onset of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as delegations from Kyiv and Moscow convened in Abu Dhabi for unprecedented trilateral negotiations mediated by the United States. Following years of entrenched trench warfare and stalled diplomatic efforts, the geopolitical landscape shifted rapidly in January 2026 under the direct influence of the Trump administration's renewed foreign policy. The path to this summit was paved by high-level back-channel discussions involving U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who met with Russian President Vladimir Putin to establish a framework for direct engagement. This Abu Dhabi summit represents the first time since the early months of 2022 that senior officials from all three powers have occupied the same venue with the explicit mandate to draft a comprehensive peace deal. International observers note that the United Arab Emirates was chosen as a neutral ground capable of providing the necessary security and discretion for such high-stakes maneuvering. As the talks commenced on January 23rd, the atmosphere was described by participants as professional but incredibly tense, reflecting the deep-seated animosity and the hundreds of thousands of lives lost during the conflict. President Trump's Board of Peace initiative has become the primary vehicle for these discussions, aiming to deliver on campaign promises of a swift resolution to the European crisis. While the world watches, the opening session in the UAE has focused on establishing a sustainable ceasefire line, yet the fundamental disagreements over national sovereignty and international law continue to loom over the proceedings. The global community remains cautiously optimistic, though veteran diplomats warn that the presence of high-level negotiators does not inherently guarantee a signed treaty given the complexity of the demands. This first stage of the talks is primarily focused on the de-escalation of active hostilities to create a stable environment for the more difficult territorial discussions that are scheduled to follow. At the very heart of the Abu Dhabi negotiations lies the most contentious and seemingly intractable issue of the entire conflict: the legal status of Ukrainian territory currently under Russian occupation. Reports from international news agencies confirm that the Russian delegation has entered the talks with a rigid stance, demanding that Ukraine formally acknowledge Russian sovereignty over the Donbass region and other seized areas as a prerequisite for any permanent peace. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has countered this by stating emphatically that it is all about the land, signaling that Ukraine is not prepared to simply sign away its internationally recognized borders without significant concessions or security ironclads. The 2026 talks have reached a critical juncture where the definition of victory for both sides is being interrogated by U.S. mediators who are pushing for a realistic settlement. The specific sticking point remains whether a land-for-peace swap is even feasible under the current Ukrainian constitution and the prevailing public sentiment in Kyiv. Russia's insistence on a full Ukrainian withdrawal from the administrative borders of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions remains a non-starter for the Ukrainian delegation, which views such a move as a total capitulation. Meanwhile, the U.S. team has been exploring various formulas for frozen status or demilitarized zones that might allow both leaders to claim a degree of success to their domestic audiences. However, the reality on the ground remains a complicating factor, as the front lines are still active even as the diplomats argue over maps and luxury hotels. The international press has highlighted that any deal regarding territory will require not just the signatures of Putin and Zelenskyy, but also the acceptance of a global community that has spent years sanctioning Russia for these very land grabs. The tension in the meeting rooms remains focused on whether Ukraine can be persuaded to accept a temporary loss of control in exchange for a permanent end to the rain of missiles. The third pillar of the trilateral talks involves the long-term security architecture of Ukraine, a topic that is inextricably linked to the territorial dispute. For Kyiv, any peace deal that does not include ironclad security guarantees is viewed as a mere pause that would allow Russia to rearm and strike again in the future. The Ukrainian delegation continues to push for a clear path to NATO membership or a series of bilateral defense treaties with Western powers that would function similarly to Article 5. Conversely, the Kremlin has maintained that Ukrainian neutrality and a permanent ban on NATO integration are red-line requirements for any cessation of hostilities. U.S. negotiators are currently tasked with finding a third way that provides Ukraine with the means to defend itself without triggering the Russian demand for a completely demilitarized neighbor. This includes discussions on the Porcupine model, where Ukraine remains outside of formal alliances but receives sustained, long-term military hardware and intelligence support from the United States. International articles report that the concept of an international peacekeeping force, possibly involving non-NATO nations, is being discussed as a buffer along the eventual line of control. The difficulty lies in the enforcement mechanism. Ukraine is wary of past agreements like the Budapest Memorandum, which failed to prevent the 2014 and 2022 invasions. Therefore, the Abu Dhabi talks are diving deep into the technicalities of what constitutes a guarantee in a modern era. The Russian side views any Western military presence in Ukraine as a threat to its national security, while the Ukrainian side views the absence of such a presence as an invitation for further Russian aggression. Balancing these diametrically opposed security requirements is the primary focus of the afternoon sessions, as mediators attempt to draft a document that provides security without provocation, a task that many seasoned analysts believe may be the hardest part of the entire peace process. As the talks progress, the financial cost of the war and the mechanism for rebuilding Ukraine have emerged as a massive secondary conflict within the negotiations. A significant flashpoint occurred when President Zelenskyy publicly dismissed a Russian proposal regarding the use of frozen Russian sovereign assets. The Russian plan suggested that some of these funds, currently held in Western accounts, should be redirected to fund reconstruction in Russian-controlled areas, including the Kursk region, which saw Ukrainian incursions. Zelenskyy labeled this proposal nonsense, insisting that the hundreds of billions of dollars in frozen assets must be used exclusively for the recovery of Ukrainian infrastructure and the compensation of its citizens. The U.S. mediators are caught in the middle of this financial tug-of-war, as the Trump administration looks for ways to fund Ukraine's reconstruction without relying solely on U.S. taxpayer money. The Abu Dhabi sessions have touched upon the possibility of a reconstruction fund managed by an international body, but the legal hurdles surrounding the seizure and transfer of Russian state assets remain a major obstacle. Furthermore, Russia is seeking the lifting of international sanctions as a core component of the peace deal, arguing that its economy must be reintegrated into the global market for the region to remain stable. Western allies, particularly in Europe, are hesitant to grant sanctions relief without a full withdrawal of Russian forces, creating a deadlock. The economic dimension of the talks also includes the future of energy exports and the repair of destroyed pipelines, which are vital for the European economy. The factual reality is that the physical destruction in Ukraine is estimated in the trillions of dollars, and the Abu Dhabi talks are the first time that a concrete bill for the peace has been put on the table. Without an agreement on who pays for the damage, a lasting peace remains elusive, as neither side is willing to bear the financial burden of a war they believe they did not start. The final component of the Abu Dhabi summit involves the broader international reaction and the significant skepticism emanating from European capitals. While the US, Ukraine, and Russia are the primary actors at the table, the absence of the European Union from the core trilateral group has caused friction. German and French officials have expressed public doubt regarding Vladimir Putin's sincerity, suggesting that Russia may be using the talks as a tactical maneuver to fracture Western unity or to buy time for a new offensive. These European leaders have warned that any peace deal must be just and lasting, and not a dictated peace imposed by the superpowers. The CNN reports and other international bulletins emphasize that the Trump administration is moving at a pace that has left some traditional allies feeling sidelined. Inside the UAE summit, the pressure to produce a win by the Saturday deadline is immense, but the factual discrepancies between the two warring parties remain vast. The world is looking at this January 23rd meeting as a potential turning point that could either end the largest conflict in Europe since World War II or lead to a further escalation if the talks collapse. President Trump remains optimistic, frequently citing his ability to close the deal, yet the ground reality of the Donbass and the security of Kyiv are not easily solved by rhetoric alone. As the final sessions approach, the focus remains on whether a ceasefire can be announced as a down payment on a larger treaty. The geopolitical stakes could not be higher, as the outcome will define the international order for the next generation. If the Abu Dhabi talks succeed, they will be remembered as a masterpiece of unconventional diplomacy. If they fail, the conflict likely enters a new, even more dangerous phase of attrition. For now, the world remains in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the final communique from the UAE to see if the land, the security, and the blood can finally be settled through a signature rather than a shell.